In the election of 1860 in our country, it was one of the most unusual elections ever. Abraham Lincoln won, but he was one of four parties to be running. He had not one competitor, but three. So as a result, of course, he won. He did not win 50+% of the vote. Not a single southern state wanted Lincoln, of course. They all figured that he would be an abolitionist. So he didn't get a single electoral vote from the entire South, and he sort of barely squeaked in. And he was already receiving death threats of one kind or another, even before he made the long trip to Washington. But in February of 1861, he got on the train in his hometown of Springfield, Illinois. That's where he had been a lawyer for a quarter of a century and had also served in Congress. He got on the train to go to Washington for his inaugural. Now, in the time between his election in November and getting on the train, from November to February, the very first states in the South began to secede. South Carolina was the first. And so he knew that he was in for kind of perhaps a not very cheerful welcome, because although we don't really think of it in that way, Washington, D.C. really was in the South. The state of Maryland and Virginia that surround Washington, D.C. were both slave states. And so when he got partway along on his train trip, he would stop at every station. There'd be big crowds there, and he would get out and he'd talk to the people. Not always real long, but he would, politically, he would maximize this exposure to the people in the days before television. But by the time he got to Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, which was well into the journey, things were not looking very good, and his Secret Service agents in charge of protecting him were getting very apprehensive. Not only had they been hearing of rumors of plots and death threats, but the track had been sabotaged at one point along the way. It was detected before causing any derailment. But then they also found like a grenade bomb on the train, unexploded, and that, of course, freaked everybody out. And so they said to Lincoln, "You can't finish your trip," because to get from Harrisburg to go through Philadelphia and then Baltimore and then D.C., Baltimore was in the middle of a slave state, and they said it's too dangerous. What we want to do is disguise you and bundle you hidden into D.C., where we can then protect you. And Lincoln said, "I don't want to do that." And they said, "You have to, Mr. President." And the guy that finally persuaded him was Allan Pinkerton, the founder of the famous Pinkerton Security Services. So they bundled him up like an invalid, and in the middle of the night, changed trains, got him on a secret train through Philadelphia, through Baltimore, and into D.C., but pretending that he was a sick guy, and they did not use his name in buying his tickets. They switched tickets, slipped him into D.C. in the dark of night, and also had his family get off early, and then they sort of smuggled them into D.C. by another route also. And so he got into town, and he was safe. The downside is that the papers, especially the Southern papers, mocked him for being such a wuss and for not entering Washington like a president. But the cartoons just savaged him, showing him wearing the clothing of other countries like you're a traitor, or the rumors spread that he was disguised as a woman, so they had cartoons of him in a dress and just mocked the heck out of him. And he always regretted that he caved and slipped into Washington secretly. He wished he had entered like a president. He figured he was a dead man anyway. He actually realized upon his election that it's very likely that he was not going to die a normal death. He sort of called himself an old man, kind of a dead man walking. And I'm going to be killed at some point, he thought, and why should I start caving already at the front end of my presidency? But the fact is, he got in safe and sound, but in a kind of a slinky, devious, underhanded, quiet way. In a sense, you know what? I think Jesus' disciples wanted to persuade him to enter Jerusalem in the same way. They couldn't understand why he was going there. It was the absolute center of hatred and hostility to him. One of his disciples said to him, "Well, I guess if he's determined to go, we might as well go too and die with him." They were really aware that this was not going to be an ordinary Passover, but Jesus insisted, and he didn't slip in disguise. He intentionally arranged a sort of a publicity, I won't call it a stunt because it wasn't very braggy. In fact, if anything, it was humble.